Okay, stop scrolling. You turned a tap on today, probably 4 or 5 times, and you did not check first, because water always comes out. You have never once planned a day around finding it. Now take the tap away. It has not rained properly for 3 years. So, where are you walking? Because that is the actual question, and almost nobody asks it properly. We talk about ancient humans hunting, painting, making tools, burying their dead. We very rarely stop on the fact that every single one of those people, every day of their lives, had a water problem, and that the water problem was the one that could kill them in 72 hours. And here is what makes it interesting rather than just grim. Our ancestors lived through droughts that would flatten a modern nation. Not dry summers. Droughts measured in centuries. They did it without wells, without pumps, without pipes, and without any physical ability to store water in their own bodies. The way they managed it is genuinely one of the most impressive things our species has ever done. And the answer is not a technique. Let's go. Start with scale, because if you do not fix the scale in your head, nothing else in this video will land properly. When you hear the word drought, you are probably picturing a bad summer. Reservoirs low, hosepipe ban, brown grass. Something that ends. That is not what we are talking about. Sediment cores drilled from the floor of Lake Malawi have given researchers a record of East African climate stretching back well over 100,000 years, and what it shows is brutal. During a long stretch, roughly between 135,000 and 75,000 years ago, that region went through repeated megadroughts, and the lake itself dropped catastrophically, not by a few meters. Analyses of that record suggest the water level fell by something on the order of 95%. Sit with that. One of the largest lakes on the continent, reduced to a fraction of itself, repeatedly, over tens of thousands of years. That is the environment in which anatomically modern humans were becoming what we are. And it kept happening. Much later, and much closer to home in a historical sense, the Sahara was green. During what is called the African humid period, the region we now think of as the driest place on the planet, held lakes, grassland, rivers, hippos, crocodiles, and people. There is rock art of swimmers in what is now bone-dry desert. Then, from around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, it dried, and it dried more or less permanently, and an entire habitable world closed. So when we ask how ancient humans survived drought, we are not asking about a rough patch. We are asking how a fragile, water-dependent primate came through repeated multi-generational collapses of its own water supply, and did it well enough that you exist. Which brings us to the body, and the bad news. You are terrible at this. Genuinely, structurally terrible. You have no water storage system. There is no reservoir, no hump, nothing you can fill in advance. Camels can take on enormous quantities of water very quickly and tolerate losing a quarter or more of their body water. You start to get into serious trouble at a fraction of that. A loss of a few % of your body mass in water already measurably degrades your thinking and your endurance, and in real heat, without any water at all, you are looking at something like 3 days, sometimes less. And it is worse than that, because the thing that makes humans exceptional is also the thing that drains us. We cool ourselves by evaporating water off our skin across a huge bare surface, and that is precisely why we can keep moving in heat when other animals have to stop. But every liter of that advantage is a liter gone. In hard heat, a person can lose 1 to 2 liters an hour. Our superpower runs on the exact resource that disappears in a drought. And there is a complication people almost never mention, which is that sweat is not water. It is salty. When you sweat hard for hours, you are not only losing volume, you are losing sodium, and that changes the problem completely. If you replace a great deal of lost fluid with plain water, while your salt is already depleted, you can push your blood sodium dangerously low, and that is its own emergency. It is a real hazard for modern endurance athletes, and it would have been a real hazard for anyone working hard in heat. Which means the drought problem is actually 2 problems stacked. You need water, and you need what the water washes out of you. Meat, blood, certain plants, and in some regions specific mineral sources all matter here, and you cannot solve heat with water alone. You have to keep eating while you are doing it, which is a difficult thing to arrange in the exact conditions where food is also failing. So we cannot store it, we leak it constantly, we lose salt along with it, and we die quickly without it. On the face of it, we should not have made it through any of this. So, how did they do it? The first answer is that they stored water. Just not in their bodies. They stored it in their heads. An experienced person in a dry landscape carries something no other animal carries, which is a detailed, ranked, seasonal map of every water source across an enormous area, not just where water is. Which sources last longest into a dry season, which go bad, which are reliable after rain and which are not, which ones require digging, how far apart they are, and therefore which routes are survivable and which are not. That is an enormous body of information, and its value is absolute. In a landscape where water is scarce and unevenly distributed, knowing where it is not a convenience. It is the difference between a route being a journey and a route being a death, and you can be told it. That is the part that matters. A young person does not have to discover a water source by nearly dying near it. They can be walked there, told about it, and made to repeat it back until it is theirs, which means the teaching has to happen in the good years. You cannot start explaining dry season water during a drought, because by then the walking is already dangerous. The knowledge gets installed in advance, in children, while there is still slack in the system, by adults who may never see it used. In parts of Aboriginal Australia, knowledge of routes and the water along them is bound into song, story, and ceremony, tied to specific places in sequence. I want to be careful and respectful about how I put this, because these are living traditions belonging to living people, and not a curiosity from the past. But the functional point is striking. Encode a route into something people sing, and it becomes far harder to lose than a fact somebody happens to remember. You have made the water map into something the group performs, which means it gets rehearsed, corrected, and handed on whether or not anyone is currently thirsty. That is a genuinely extraordinary piece of engineering, and it is made entirely out of language. And the map is not the only source of information. The landscape is full of animals that also need water, and every one of them is a signal. Bees have to drink, and they fly efficiently, which means a bee heading purposefully in a straight line is telling you something. Doves and sandgrouse commute to water at predictable times of day, so a flight path at dawn is a direction. Tracks converge as they approach water and diverge as they leave it, which means a set of prints has an arrow in it, if you can read which way the traffic is heavier. Certain insects and frogs only occur where moisture persists. And the best of it is that other animals do the digging for you. Elephants excavate wells in dry riverbeds with their feet and trunks, going down through sand to water below, and once they have finished, that hole is available to everything else in the neighborhood, including people. An elephant is a public works department that does not know it. So a person crossing dry country is not guessing. They are reading a landscape that is continuously reporting on itself, in a language made of flight lines and footprints, and cross-checking it against a memorized map. Now the physical technology, because there is some, and one piece of it is lovely. Somebody, a very long time ago, worked out that an ostrich egg is a container. You blow or drill a small hole in one end, empty it, and you have a strong, light, sealable vessel that holds around a liter. Plug it with grass or beeswax and you have a canteen. This is not speculation. Fragments of worked ostrich eggshell turn up across African sites over enormous spans of time, and at Deep Kloof Rock Shelter in South Africa, there are engraved eggshell pieces dated to around 60,000 years ago, marked with deliberate geometric patterns. People were not only making water flasks, they were decorating them, and quite possibly marking whose was whose. But the eggshell is not the clever part. The clever part is where they put them. Among Kalahari communities, there are documented practices of filling ostrich eggshells and burying them at known points out in the landscape, in caches, along routes people expect to travel. Which means the water is no longer only at the waterhole. The water is distributed across the country, in small hidden deposits, in places you can only find if you know. Think about what that actually is. It is a network of supply points, positioned in advance, with no signs, no records, and no landmarks that mean anything to an outsider. The entire index exists in people's memories. A stranger could walk over that landscape and die of thirst standing directly on top of a liter of water. Then there is the business of getting water out of places that do not look like they have any. A dry riverbed is usually not dry. It is a sand-filled channel with water sitting below the surface, and if you know where the bends and the bedrock force it upwards, you can dig down and find it. There are documented techniques of digging a small well in damp sand, inserting a hollow reed, packing grass around it as a filter, and drawing water up through it by suction, transferring it mouthful by mouthful into an eggshell. It is slow, it is laborious, and it works. Plants are the other reservoir. Various tubers and roots hold usable moisture. In the Kalahari, the tsama melon is a genuine water source, a fruit that is mostly liquid, and there are periods when it is possible to live off them. Elsewhere it is rock catchments, natural basins in stone that hold rainwater long after open ground has dried, or dew collected off surfaces in the early morning. None of this is dramatic. All of it is the difference between living and not. Now let me take the story you have almost certainly absorbed about drought and pull it apart, because this is where everything you think you know gets quietly dismantled. The popular version goes like this. A great civilization is thriving. The rains fail. Crops fail. Cities empty. The society collapses. The survivors scatter, and the ruins get swallowed by jungle or sand. Drought as an executioner. It is a very satisfying story, and it is much too clean. Take the most famous case. You have heard that the Maya collapsed because of drought. There is genuine evidence for severe drying in the Yucatan during the relevant centuries, from lake sediments and cave formations, and it is very likely part of the picture. But the more carefully people have looked, the messier it has become. Different cities failed at different times. Some in the north continued or even flourished, while southern centers were abandoned, and the political situation was already strained. Drought was pressure applied to systems that had their own problems. And there is a much bigger correction that should be said plainly. The Maya did not disappear. There are millions of Maya people alive today, speaking Mayan languages, in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and beyond. Describing them as a civilization that vanished is not just historically sloppy, it erases living people. What ended was a particular political order in particular cities. The same caution applies more broadly. There is a genuine climate event around 4,200 years ago, an episode of aridification visible in records across a wide area, and it is often lined up neatly against the fall of the Akkadian Empire and changes in the Indus region. The correlation is real and interesting. The confident causal story that gets built on it is not settled, and archaeologists argue about how much weight it can carry. When you see a graph of dust or isotopes placed next to a list of collapsed states, treat the arrow between them as a hypothesis. And while I am being honest about limits, there is a bigger one running underneath this whole video that I should name. A great deal of what we know about surviving drought without technology comes from studying living peoples in dry places, in southern Africa and Australia and elsewhere. That knowledge is real and it is deep. But those communities are not living fossils, and they are not a window onto the Pleistocene. They have their own histories, their own recent upheavals, and they have been pushed onto marginal land by other people. Using them as a model for our ancestors is an inference, and a rough one. I lean on it in this video because it is the best evidence we have for what is possible without pipes. I do not want to pretend it is the same as evidence about the past. So if drought does not simply execute societies, what actually happens? People move. And this is the reversal that matters, because we have been taught to read movement as failure. It is not failure, it is the strategy. For most of our history, mobility was not what you did when things went wrong, it was the entire design. If water fails here, you go there, because you already know where there is, because you were there last year. A group that packs up and walks 400 kilometers has not suffered a catastrophe. It has executed a plan, which reframes something big. The reason drought becomes devastating is not that the rain stopped. It is that you cannot leave. And that gives you a genuinely uncomfortable idea to sit with. Agriculture, the thing we treat as the great step forward, made drought worse. A farmer is anchored. You have a field, and the field is a specific piece of ground that either receives water or does not, and you cannot carry it with you. You have a stored surplus, which is wonderful until the surplus runs out and you have nowhere to be. You may have irrigation, which is superb until the river drops, and which in some settings slowly poisons the soil with salt as evaporating water leaves its minerals behind. And you have far more people in one place than the local water can support in a bad decade, because the good decades let the population grow. Every one of those is a strength in a normal year and a liability in a drought. When the Sahara dried, people concentrated. They moved toward permanent water, and above all toward the Nile, a river fed from somewhere else entirely, and therefore reliable when the surrounding land was not. That concentration is part of how the ancient Egyptian world came to exist, which is a strange thought. Some of the earliest and grandest sedentary societies are partly a product of a drought, built by people packed against the last reliable water. The response to losing water was to gather in the one place that still had it, and gathering in one place is exactly what makes a society brittle when that place has a bad century. But I have saved the real answer, because none of what I have described so far is the thing that actually got people through. Water knowledge is essential. Eggshells and sand wells and melons are all genuinely useful. Mobility is the core strategy. But all of it collapses on one problem, and it is a social one. If your water fails and you walk 200 kilometers to a place that still has water, there are already people there. And they have every reason to tell you to keep walking. Their water is finite too. You are a cost. In most of the animal world, that is the end of the conversation, because territory is defended, and an outsider arriving in a drought is a competitor. So the actual technology that survives drought is not a container. It is the answer to that question. It is having a reason for the people at the water to let you drink. And before I tell you what that was, I should be honest about what we do not know, because this is exactly the point where people like to reach for a dramatic answer. You might expect the archaeology to be full of evidence for fighting over water. It is not, or at least not in any way that lets us make confident claims. Interpersonal violence does show up in the human skeletal record, and it is real. But tying specific injuries to specific droughts over specific water sources is beyond what the evidence supports. There is no layer we can point to and say, here, two groups fought at the last water hole. What we do have is the pattern in living dry country societies, and it is not mainly violent, it is negotiated. Access to water gets managed through relationships, permissions, kinship claims and obligations, and the interesting thing is how much of that negotiating happens years before anybody is thirsty. And humans built that, deliberately, over generations, in advance. Among Juhoansi communities in the Kalahari, there is a practice usually called charo. It is a system of delayed gift exchange between named partners, often over long distances. You give something, not for immediate return and not in a transaction. What you are actually doing is maintaining a relationship, and that relationship carries an obligation, and the obligation includes access. A person with many charo partners spread across a wide area has, in effect, standing permission to be somewhere else. Read that again, because it is the whole video. That is insurance, not metaphorically, structurally. You pay small regular premiums, in the form of gifts and visits and attention, over years, to people you may not need, so that when your water fails you are not a stranger arriving at somebody else's water hole. You are Nitsao's partner, and Nitsao is expected to make room. And notice what that does to the concept of wealth. In a landscape where you cannot store water, cannot store food for long, and have to carry everything you own, hoarding is close to pointless. So value gets held in a different medium. The rational thing to accumulate is obligations. Your savings are people. That is not a soft, sentimental observation. It is the hardest engineering in this entire subject. Anyone can find water in a good year. Surviving the bad decade requires that somebody 200 kilometers away, whose water is also short, chooses to share it with you. Everything else is equipment. That is infrastructure. Let's bring all of this together, because the shape of it is the answer. Ancient humans survived droughts that lasted longer than nations do, and they did it with a body that cannot store water and leaks it in the heat. They managed it by holding the water map in their memories, and by making that map into song so it could not be lost. By turning eggs into canteens and burying them across the country where only they could find them. By pulling water up out of dry sand through a reed, and out of melons and roots and hollows in rock. By treating movement as a plan rather than a defeat. And, above everything else, by spending their entire lives building relationships with distant people, specifically so that those relationships would exist before they were needed. The technology that beat drought was other people, arranged in advance. So go back to your tap. You have no water map. You could not name a single natural source near you that runs reliably in a dry summer. You have no cache, no container, no reciprocal partner 300 kilometers away who owes you a place to stand. You have a pipe, and behind the pipe a reservoir, and behind the reservoir a system of people you have never met and never thanked, doing maintenance you never think about. Which means you are not less dependent on other people than your ancestors were. You are far more dependent on far more strangers, in a way you cannot see and could not repair. They knew exactly who owed them water, and they had spent a lifetime earning it. You just turn the handle, and trust. The difference between you and them is not competence, and it is not safety. It is only that you never had to learn whose name to remember.